What do you think is the mental model for people in Congress to be considering things like this? There's a lot of considerations for something like Bitcoin. So there's everything from this is money we don't control. This is money that people can use without us being able to track at times.
Right.
We know some tracking can be done, but this is also money which kind of offers, well, it's a commodity that offers some freedom, which obviously some people within the US are much more, like in Congress level, care about freedom or claim to care about freedom. But then there's this myriad of things it does globally for other states. The US has routinely done a mixture of interfere, but also help people in other states. I'm not going to say everything the US has done is bad. We can equally spot everything that's happened in Iraq and agree that's terrible, but we can also recognize other programs that come from out of the US which have helped people in other countries. It is a complicated picture. How do you think the mental model works for these people? Does it all come down to what their constituents think and maintaining power? Or do you think there are people who are genuinely in Congress who are ideologically driven to do good?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah,
I would start by sort of saying that, you sort of point out the adventurism in the Middle East as like a prime example of bad U.S. policy. And then you sort of allude generally to things that the U.S. government does that maybe aren't so bad. One example of that is that the State Department, funds pretty significantly internet infrastructure all over the world. Why? The internet's not American. The internet is open and more or less decentralized. No single party really controls the internet. It brings with it both great benefits and some costs, but we fund it. Why? We fund it because the internet at its core represents the fundamental values of Western liberal democracy, free and open exchange of information. It's sort of the bedrock of the trend of globalization has been that the internet was able to connect and empower people who previously would have never even interacted, much less collaborated together on a project via Zoom or like Google Docs. So I think Bitcoin is the same way, where the internet is not controlled by the United States. We have disproportionately benefited from it, and in large part that's because we've made it a great place for most of the internet's existence to be a tech entrepreneur. Whether it's sort of our strong IP laws, taxes, whatever. There is a set of environments through policy that the United States has crafted that has allowed it to take a disproportionate stake in the success of the internet. And so I think my general framework for talking about Bitcoin to staffers or to politicians, it's really not that different from just a normal tech policy issue. Like, that's the story of tech regulation, is that the government crafts laws and then technologies that no one could have foreseen, for which laws could not have accounted, develop. And then people have to figure out, okay, what is this stuff? How do we cap its potential downside? And how do we maximize its upside for us? And it's a natural thing. There are so many examples throughout history of technology stripping away some facets of state power, and everyone kind of having to just readjust and reorganize around that. So the printing press, it was only the Catholic Church that could create and disseminate information. The printing press gets invented. All right, genie's out of the bottle. Now anybody can go print information. Then the internet happens. Now anyone can take that information and send it anywhere to anyone. Then Bitcoin happens. Now anyone can take value and use the rails of the internet to send and exchange value anywhere in the world. And like those other two examples, I think the printing press and the internet, yes, had some risks, but were like quite obviously, and especially in hindsight, wonderfully net positive. So,
well, this takes me back to this thought experiment from Craig Wormski. What he was trying to do was explain that people have a bias, they come with a bias, and you have to try and do a thought experiment to get people away from that and just explain to them two different worlds. There's a world with Bitcoin and a world without Bitcoin. But when you make the decision of the world you want, you have to strip away all your experience, knowledge of your existence, everything you've been through. So when you go into that world, you don't know whether you're... So let's use Elizabeth Warren. You don't know if you're going to come into that world as Elizabeth Warren or you're going to come into that as a Bangladeshi market trader. You've got no idea. You could be dropped in North Korea. So if you don't know where you are going to be in that world, the odds of you coming out as a senator are very, very small. The odds of you coming out of just some normal pleb living in a third world country are a lot higher.
Yeah.
So if you don't know which world you're going to come into, but you have all the data and information on how the world works, would you want to live in a world with Bitcoin, with a form of money which is open, permissionless, censorship resistant, you can send value around the world instantly and free to anyone, or would you want to live in a world without that? Because you could be dropped into a place where you don't have banking services, you're under authoritarian rule, and there's a serious risk. And the thing that this highlights is the people who make the decision, the people who make these decisions are the one who have the biggest risk from these technologies. Therefore, they have an outweighted bias in making their decision. And it's super important.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And even from a self-interested lens, Peter, I think that policymakers will increasingly realize that properly considered, Bitcoin is quite good for the United States. Mm-hmm. So Matthew Pines wrote a really good white paper for us on this called Bitcoin and National Security.
Yep.
And he essentially makes like three very reasonable arguments that are worth kind of going over. So the first argument that he makes is kind of what I alluded to, that Bitcoin has at its very core principles that line up well with democracy, what our notion and construction of civil liberties and rights, and kind of just the traditional lowercase l, like liberal worldview, free markets, minimal government interference, personal liberty and autonomy, these kind of natural God-given rights, and that the more people who use Bitcoin, the more America benefits, especially in a world in which countries like China are trying to make parallel institutions to those in the West. So you see for 40 years the dominance of the International Monetary Fund, and then China comes out with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and now there's a new game in town. The same is true for most modern financial global infrastructure. It's mostly been a Western thing. Now we are seeing parallel alternatives crafted by authoritarians, and those systems are different in many ways, but most importantly is that they're closed. They're permissioned, they're surveillable. They readily enable things like social credit scoring. And so for every person who lives in a country who is experiencing the problems of the decline of correspondent banking, something that like Mahler's talks about a lot, who are looking around and trying to figure out what option they should use, every person that picks Bitcoin rather than China's CBDC, that constitutes a win for the United States. So his first argument is this nice kind of just broad articulation of why Bitcoin is this very American thing, the benefits of which are not always immediately direct, but positive for a country like the United States, who at least in principle exists both to govern its country and also spread these democratic principles abroad. The second argument that Matthew makes is that you kind of get in or miss the boat. And if we're able to, the United States, by we, is able to craft policies that encourage entrepreneurship and innovation to happen here, even if we don't control Bitcoin in the same way that we don't control the internet, we can still position ourselves to experience a disproportionate benefit. You could almost think of it as like a quasi-seigniorage, where if major exchanges, wallet providers, miners are located here, then as the network scales and more people use Bitcoin, we're kind of setting ourselves up to do just fine. The second argument he makes is that there's this kind of just intuitive economic benefit of you don't want some of the smartest minds in cryptography and computer science leaving this country to go start products and services elsewhere. And then
Go on. No, finish your third point.
Well, yeah. And then his third point is all about sort of combating China. It's basically saying that China has constructed a system called the Belt and Road Initiative. I think people have probably talked about this in your podcast before. The TLDR version is that we are years away from having a CBDC in the United States, if ever. And so for right now, as China is rolling out DCEP, the name of its CBDC, and has extensive trade relationships with the very people who are in the regions most underserved and increasingly underserved by the legacy financial system, it is useful for the United States to see the rise of an open, neutral monetary network that offers people a choice. Because if you have to choose between a Chinese CBDC or Bitcoin, that choice is very obvious. But unfortunately, if your choice is no other options or a Chinese CBDC, it's also very obvious which one you choose. And so I think that Bitcoin puts this like downward pressure on the shittiness of government CBDC projects.